She didn't ask for toys. She didn't ask for money. She only had one wish, and she whispered it to a flame she wasn't sure could hear her. Her name was Mira. 7 years old. A birthday cake with a single candle. A sweater 3 sizes too big, because it was the last thing her mother ever wore. She sat alone on the floor of a building the city had already forgotten, holding that small cake like it was the most precious thing in the world. And maybe, to her, it was. Because Mira had only one wish. Not for a new home. Not for food. Not even to stop crying. She just wanted to see her mom one more time. That night, in the shadows of the same alley, a man in a charcoal suit stood frozen, a man who had never once been stopped in his tracks by anything life threw at him. A man the world called powerful. A man who had forgotten what it felt like to want something you couldn't buy. Until he heard her. Dan didn't plan to change her life that night. But when Mira closed her eyes and made her wish, something in the universe shifted, and he felt it too. What he did next, nobody could have predicted. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. She was singing to no one. That was the first thing that stopped him. Dan Mercer had been to 100 of these events, the staged handshakes, the press-ready smiles, the carefully selected backdrops designed to make a billionaire look human for 30 minutes. Detroit's South Side was today's backdrop. His publicist had chosen it well. Crumbling row houses. A soup kitchen with fresh paint that hadn't dried yet. Cameras from 3 networks. It was theater, and everyone knew their lines. Everyone except the little girl around the corner. He heard her before he saw her. A voice so small it should have been swallowed by the city noise, but somehow it cut straight through. A lullaby, soft and broken, the kind of song you sing not because you feel like singing but because the silence is too heavy to carry alone. Dan paused mid-sentence. His PR manager kept talking. The cameras kept rolling. But something in his chest moved, the way ice shifts before it breaks, and without a word to anyone, he turned and walked toward the sound. She was sitting on the steps of an abandoned building, her knees pulled to her chest, a small cake balanced on a white plate in her lap. One candle. Still lit, somehow, even though the evening wind had no business leaving it alone. She wore a sweater that had once belonged to someone much larger, the sleeves swallowed her hands whole. Her braids were neat, careful, the kind of neat that meant someone had once loved doing them. Her cheeks were wet. She didn't see him. She just kept singing. Dan stood at the edge of the alley and listened until the song ended. Then the little girl opened her eyes, looked at the candle, and whispered something so quietly that he shouldn't have been able to hear it. But he did. "I just want to see you, Mama. One more time." She blew the candle out. Dan stood in the dark for a long moment after that, his driver somewhere behind him, his entire media team somewhere ahead of him, and every carefully constructed version of himself dissolving in the cold Detroit air. He did not go back to the cameras that evening. He sat in the back of his car for 2 hours, staring at nothing, and when his phone rang for the 11th time, he finally answered. "Find out who she is," he said. "The girl with the cupcake. I want to know everything." His team was efficient. They always were. Within 48 hours, a folder landed on Dan's desk in his Chicago high-rise, printed, because his chief of staff knew he read things he could hold. Her name was Mira Josephine Okafor, 7 years old. Born in Detroit. No living relatives on record within the state. Her mother, Adiz Okafor, had died 14 months ago, an aggressive form of cancer that had moved faster than the insurance appeals. Adiz had been 29. She'd worked 2 jobs, kept a small apartment, raised Mira with the kind of focused love that doesn't have room for much else. After she passed, Mira had slipped through the cracks of a system stretched too thin. A foster placement that fell apart. A group home she'd quietly walked away from 3 weeks ago. Nobody had filed a report yet. Nobody had noticed. Dan read the file twice. Then he looked at the photograph clipped to the inside cover, Adiz Okafor, smiling at a birthday party, Mira on her hip, both of them lit up like the flash couldn't contain them. He closed the folder. He thought about a different photograph, the one on his own mantel at home, his late wife, Colette, laughing on a boat somewhere off the Carolina coast, 3 years before the accident. He thought about how grief doesn't shrink. It just learns to share a room with you. He picked up his phone. I need the address. She didn't trust him. That was the right instinct, and she had a child's unfiltered version of it, eyes narrow, chin lifted, the cake plate held against her chest like a shield. Dan came alone this time. No cameras. No team. He crouched down to her level on those same broken steps and didn't speak for a moment, because he'd learned a long time ago that silence said more than any opener could. I heard your wish, he said finally. Mira stared at him. You can't give me that. No, he agreed. Not the way you're imagining. But I want to tell you something. There might be another way. A different kind of way. I'm not going to promise it's perfect, because it isn't. But it's real, and it belongs to you if you want it. Why would you do that? She asked. Sharp question for a 7-year-old. He respected it. Because I know what it's like to miss someone so much it feels like the missing is the only thing left of you. He paused. And because I think your mom deserves better than a wish nobody heard. Mira looked at him for a long time. Long enough that a grown adult would have broken the silence. She didn't. What kind of different way? She asked. He told her. Carefully, honestly, without overselling it. She asked 2 questions, both of them better than the questions his executives asked in boardrooms. Then she was quiet again, looking at the cold candle on her cake. Okay, she said. But if you're lying, I'll know. I believe you, Dan said. And he meant it. The drive from Detroit to Dan's estate outside Lake Forest, Illinois took 4 hours. Mira spent the first hour with her face pressed to the window, watching the highway lights blur past. She spent the second hour asleep, her head tipped sideways against the glass, the cake plate carefully balanced on her knees even in sleep, as if her hands had memorized how to hold the one thing she had left. The house, when they arrived, stopped her cold. It wasn't a house. It was the kind of structure that had its own weather. 12,000 square feet of pale stone and dark wood, set back from a lake so still at night it looked like a second sky. Mira stepped out of the car, looked up, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. It's loud, she said finally. Dan frowned. It's completely quiet. Yeah, Mira said. That's what I mean. He gave her the East Wing guest suite, which was larger than any apartment Adiz Okafor had ever rented. Mira walked through it slowly, touching the edge of the duvet, the window frame, the lamp. She didn't bounce on the bed. She moved like someone taking inventory, making sure she understood what was real. Before bed, She wandered into the main hall and stopped in front of the fireplace. The photograph of Colette was there, in its silver frame. Colette mid-laugh, the wind catching her hair, entirely herself. Mira studied it for a long time. "Is she gone?" she asked. Dan, who had followed quietly, stood beside her. "Yes." "How?" "A car accident. 4 years ago." Mira nodded slowly. Then she reached up and touched the edge of the frame, not the photo, just the silver border, and said, "She has a nice laugh. You can tell, even in a picture." Dan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tightness in his throat was its own answer, and somehow Mira seemed to understand that, because she took her hand back and looked up at him with those serious, ancient eyes. "We're the same kind of sad," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said quietly. "We are." She nodded once, like that settled something, and padded off to bed. Dan stood in front of Colette's photograph for a long time after that, and something that had been sealed in him for 4 years loosened, just slightly, at its edges. The team he assembled was quiet about their work by necessity. 3 AI engineers from a firm in Austin, people who understood what he needed without him having to explain twice. A sound reconstruction specialist from a university lab who had spent years recovering degraded audio. 2 researchers who spent 72 hours combing through every piece of digital evidence Adese Okafor had ever left on the internet. There was more than expected. Adese had been a singer herself, small videos on her phone, uploaded to a private account Mira didn't even know existed. Voice notes she'd left herself. A short video Mira had taken at age 5, completely sideways, of her mother dancing in the kitchen, singing along to something on the radio. The audio was scratchy and soft. The image was grainy and warm. But it was her. Unmistakably her. They worked in a converted room on the lower level of the estate, a space Dan had once used as a screening room. Now it held servers and light rigs and a curved projection surface and a chair in the center that Mira didn't know about yet. The AI team stitched together Adese's voice from every fragment they could find, training and retraining the model until the laughter sounded like laughter and the pauses sounded like pauses and it stopped sounding like a machine and started sounding like a mother. The visual reconstruction took longer. They pulled from every photograph, Adese at a church social, Adese at a cousin's graduation, Adese in the delivery room holding a newborn Mira, her face completely destroyed by exhaustion and joy. They built her in light, in motion, in the particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Dan watched the progress every evening. He didn't interfere. He just watched. On the 5th night, the lead engineer pulled up a test render, Adese, standing in a soft golden light, turning slowly, her expression calm and warm, and Dan had to leave the room for a few minutes. When he came back, he said, "How long until it's ready?" 3 days, the engineer said. "Make it 2. The call came on a Tuesday. It was a voice Dan recognized immediately, low, measured, the particular kind of smooth that only comes from years of practiced cruelty. His name was Garrett Holt, chief executive of Pinnacle Systems, and the man who had spent the better part of 3 years trying to dismantle Mercer Industries piece by piece through backdoor acquisitions, boardroom maneuvering, and a rotating cast of anonymous sources feeding doubt to financial journalists. "I know what you're building in that room, Dan," Garrett said. Dan set down his coffee. "Then you know it's none of your business. A grieving billionaire trying to resurrect a dead woman through artificial intelligence for a child he met in an alley. Garrett let the sentence sit. My lawyers are very interested in what a psychiatric evaluation might say about a man making decisions at that altitude with that kind of, let's call it emotional instability. I see. I'm not asking for much. Step back from the Meridian merger vote. Voluntarily. Give me the proxy, and none of this becomes a story. Dan was quiet for a moment. The lake outside his window was flat and silver in the early morning light. He thought about Mira at breakfast that morning, methodically eating her oatmeal, asking him what his job actually was, frowning skeptically when he tried to explain mergers and acquisitions, declaring that it sounded made up. Do what you need to do, Garrett, he said. And he ended the call. His attorney called within the hour, alarmed. His board chair called 20 minutes after that. His publicist was drafting a statement before noon. The machinery of threat was already moving. Dan read through the emails without expression. Then he walked downstairs to the converted screening room and stood in the doorway, watching his engineers run the final calibrations on the light rig. 2 days had become one. Tomorrow night was Mira's birthday, the real one, the official date, and everything needed to be ready. Any issues? He asked. We're solid, the lead engineer said. As long as we don't lose power, this runs perfectly. Dan noted that word. If. He called his head of security and asked for a full sweep of the building's electrical systems. Just in case. He told Mira the night before. Not the technical details. Just the shape of it. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, where she was drawing something with the set of colored pencils she'd found in the supply closet and immediately claimed without asking, and he said, Tomorrow night, I have something for your birthday. Something I want you to be ready for. She looked up. Ready how? It might be hard, he said. And it might feel like a dream. But I need you to know, before it happens, that everything you see is made with real love. Nothing in it is a lie. Mira studied him. She had this way of looking at people, direct and total, like she was reading something underneath the words. Adiz must have taught her that, or maybe she'd simply needed it, growing up the way she had. Is it Mema? She asked quietly. Dan nodded once. Mira looked back at her drawing. She didn't cry. She just pressed a little harder with the orange pencil, filling in something he couldn't quite see from his angle. Okay, she said. I'll be ready. The room glowed. Dan had asked the engineers to get it right, and they had, God help them, they had. The projection surface curved in a soft arc, and the light it held was that specific gold that exists only at the edge of magic and memory, warm enough to feel like a Sunday morning, gentle enough not to overwhelm. Mira walked in slowly, Dan a step behind her, and she stopped in the center of the room and stood very still. The chair was there. She sat down without being asked. And then, Adiz Okafor stepped into the light. She was wearing the yellow dress from the church social photograph. Her hair was natural and full. She moved the way she had moved in that sideways kitchen video, easy, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. The AI had gotten the details right in ways that made Dan's chest ache. The slight asymmetry of her smile, the way her left shoulder rose a little when she was about to speak, the particular warmth of her voice when she said, "Baby girl." Mira made a sound Dan had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Not a cry, not a gasp, something between the two, something that had been trapped inside her for 14 months looking for a way out. "Mama," she whispered. "I see you, baby. I see you so good." Dan stood in the doorway and turned away, because this moment wasn't his. And then the lights went out. Not a flicker. A full, complete cut. The emergency backups should have triggered in 4 seconds, but something was wrong upstream, something deliberate, and the room went black and Mira's voice broke the darkness like a blade. "Mama. I'm working on it," Dan said, already moving. His engineer was in the hallway, already at the junction panel. "Someone cut the external feed," he said, voice tight. Whoever did this knew exactly which line to hit. Garrett. The thought arrived without heat, just certainty. The backup system had a manual override, a junction board in the east corridor, behind a steel panel. Dan's security team was already running toward the external breach. His engineers were scrambling at the servers. But the manual override needed someone to physically hold the connection together while the transfer completed. The shielding on the secondary line had been damaged, and the bare cable was live. "Sir, you need to let the crew," his engineer started. Dan was already at the panel. "How long does someone need to hold this?" 90 seconds. "But the current. How long?" A pause. 90 seconds. He grabbed the cables. The current hit his hands like something solid, not unbearable, but real, a searing pressure through his palms and up his forearms. He held. Behind him, the engineer counted quietly, calling out to the server room. The seconds moved like concrete. At 60, he smelled something that might have been his own skin. At 90, the lights came back. He heard Mira gasp from inside the room. He released the cables. His hands were shaking. His palms were already blistering. He leaned against the wall and breathed and did not let himself make any sound at all. His engineer was staring at him. "Sir, get the medical kit," Dan said quietly. "Then go back to your post." He pressed his back to the wall, eyes closed, listening to the soft, broken sounds from inside the projection room, a child talking to her mother through light and code and grief and the stubborn human refusal to let love disappear entirely. He didn't go back inside for a long time. When he finally stepped into the doorway again, his hands wrapped in cloth, Adiz was still glowing. And Mira was laughing. It lasted 32 minutes in total. Near the end, Adiz turned toward where Mira was sitting and said, in that warm, particular voice, "Baby, I left something for you. I always meant to tell you. There's a key, a small silver one, on the blue ribbon in the wooden box at Aunt Cora's house in Cincinnati. That box is yours. It holds everything I wanted you to have when you were ready." Mira pressed her hands to her face. "I didn't know Aunt Cora. You were too small. But she's been looking. She'll find you, if someone helps her look." Mira turned and looked at Dan across the room. He nodded. Adiz's image began to soften at the edges, the way light does at dusk, not disappearing, just settling. "You are so loved, Mira Josephine. You were always so loved. Don't let the missing tell you any different." "I won't," Mira whispered. "I won't, Mama." The glow faded gently. The room returned to its regular quiet. Mira sat in the chair for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked across the room, and without saying anything, pressed her face against Dan's side in a hug that cost her everything and gave him something back he hadn't known was still missing. He wrapped his bandaged hands around her carefully, like she was something rare. Like she was. "We're going to find Aunt Cora," she said into his jacket. "First thing tomorrow," he said. She nodded. Then, very quietly, "Does it hurt? Your hands?" "Not really." "You're lying." "A little," he admitted. She pulled back and looked up at him, serious as always. "You should have let someone else do it. No one else was fast enough." Mira considered that. Then she gave him the smallest, most reluctant version of a smile, just a flicker, just enough, and said, "Okay. But next time, ask me first. I would have told you to do it anyway." Dan laughed. It came out of him genuine and startled, the kind of laugh that happens when the body doesn't have time to be dignified about it. It echoed in the quiet room, and Mira looked mildly satisfied with herself. His phone was buzzing in his pocket, his board, Garrett's lawyers, the story already breaking somewhere. Tomorrow there would be legal battles and press statements and a Meridian vote to win without a proxy he'd never give away. Tomorrow, Garrett Holt would discover that a man willing to hold live cables together in the dark for a 7-year-old's birthday wish was not a man who broke quietly under pressure. But tonight, Dan Mercer stood in a room full of fading gold, holding a little girl who had come back from the edge of invisible and understood, clearly, fully, for the first time in 4 years, that some debts are paid not in board votes or business victories, but in the precise moment you stop calculating and simply hold on. The journey with Mira wasn't ending. It was, in every way that mattered, just beginning. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, thank you. This story is about the kind of love that doesn't need a perfect moment to show up, it just shows up. If Mira's wish touched something in you, subscribe, because her story is far from over. Aunt Cora is out there. The key is waiting. And Dan Mercer is only beginning to understand what it means to be someone's home. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story has already traveled.